The rich cultural history and folklore in Japan has given rise to countless stories about malicious spirits, ghosts, and reports of extraordinary phenomena. The Japanese strongly embrace unexplained occurrences, sinister legends and myths, many of which lead to unfortunate and tragic endings. But to what extent can this belief turn into reality and eventually doom? Can a person or family be cursed? Or is this just a way to dismiss mysteries which seem to have no explanation? On September 7th, 2002, the remains of 4 adults were found inside their car at the bottom of a reservoir around Koimaru Dam, located in Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan. After DNA tests and matching dental records, along with a license plate verification, the bodies were confirmed to be those of the Yamagami family, who mysteriously and suddenly disappeared on June 3, 2001. Unfortunately, concluding one enigma only served to unveil another. The Yamagami's car was found 7 kilometers from their family home and had become visible due to the low rainfall that year, which had reduced the amount of water in the reservoir. The car was upside down, with the windscreen smashed, and the family's father, Masahiro Yamagami, in the driver's seat. However the car ended up there, it must have left no trace, no broken fences, no skid marks, or any other signs of an incident. Otherwise they would have been found much sooner. So who were the Yamagami family? And what really happened on the night of June 3rd, 2001? The Yamagami family consisted of Masahiro, aged 58, his wife Junko, aged 52, their only daughter, Chie, aged 26, and Masahiro's mother, Mie, aged 79. The family lived in a small mountainous town called Sera in Hiroshima Prefecture. They were well liked and respected within their community. Masahiro, the man of the house, was employed at a construction company. He had previously faced disapproval from his relatives when he eloped with Junko, the woman he later chose to marry, but he eventually patched things up with his family, brought together by the birth of their first and only child. His elderly mother, Mie, lived with him and his wife due to a back condition and limited mobility. 26-year-old Chie, the baby of the family, was an elementary school teacher and enjoyed popularity and affection from both fellow teachers and students alike, owing to her pleasant nature and charm. She had a close bond with her family and was happily engaged. Her mother Junko also had a good job working at a quarry. She too had many friends and got on well with her colleagues. So how and why would a seemingly happy and loved family abruptly disappear, leaving no trace or explanation, only to be discovered at the depths of a reservoir 1 year later without any clue or explanation? On June 3rd, 2001, Junko prepared for a trip to China with some work colleagues. Concerns among her colleagues started to grow when she didn't turn up the following day to meet them prior to their flight. Her husband, Masahiro, did not show up at work either. Their daughter, Chie, who usually lived in an apartment in nearby Taikara City, had come over to visit her parents the night before, which was nothing unusual. She was also supposed to work that day, but never made it to the school. These people were usually punctual and organised folk, dedicated and committed to their jobs, so this behaviour was extremely unusual, and colleagues and friends began to worry. Junko's colleagues went to check the house, but no one seemed to be there, not even the dog. Masahiro's car was gone, but Chie's car was still parked outside. Authorities were alerted and went to the house to look into these peculiar circumstances. There were no signs of robbery, forced entry, or indeed an emergency escape. While nothing in the house appeared to be disrupted, the seemingly ordinary scene held a couple of odd details. The front door was locked, which seemed so unusual in a crime-free village where everyone trusted each other and would keep their doors unlocked. Many of the lights were on, and the family's table was all laid out ready for breakfast, just like it was any other normal day. Junko's luggage, money, and passport were still there ready for her flight. Mobile phones and wallets were also left behind. Their clothes were neatly folded, ready for the coming day, and all the beds were made. Some reports also discuss the fact that authorities found that 3 sets of pajamas and 4 sets of sandals were missing from the property, further implying that the family left abruptly and in a hurry, without changing into proper clothes. How the authorities actually deduced these items were missing is beyond myself and Mr. V. The family's newspaper delivery man reported that the car was missing when he stopped by at around 4 AM, so we have to assume that they left sometime before then. Chie was the last person of the family to be seen. Her colleague confirmed that she had driven to her parents' house at 9:30 PM after giving said colleague a lift home. It had been a somewhat of a last-minute decision to go to her parents, and Chie phoned her mother to let her know she was coming that night. Local authorities searched for traces of the family everywhere, in the village and mountains, but found nothing. They interviewed neighbours, colleagues, friends, and Chie's fiancé. Everyone seemed clueless and astonished by their disappearance. It really seemed as though the whole family had just completely vanished. With no leads, scant evidence, and minimal witnesses regarding the family's whereabouts, the investigation hit a dead end until their tragic discovery over a year later. The cause of death remained elusive, as there were no discernible indications of an attack or physical harm. This made us wonder if some or all of them had been sedated. If so, it's likely that all traces of any such chemicals would be lost due to the advanced stages of decomposition. The circumstances surrounding their deaths remained shrouded in mystery, raising more questions than answers. In a nutshell, it seems as if the Yamagami family suddenly stopped whatever they were doing, grabbed their family dog, and abruptly departed from their family home, still wearing pajamas and sandals. But why? Could it have been an attempted burglary that didn't go as planned, as some have suggested? But how can we explain the fact that Junko's travel money, jewellery, everybody's phones, pages, and all the other valuable objects had been left in the house? And in such a quiet and safe neighbourhood? Surely not. Did the family intentionally decide to bring their lives to an end as a unified choice? But why would they make such a decision? And in the kind of way they did it? According to family and friends, they were not in, or at least didn't seem to be, in any kind of trouble or misery. Besides, Junko was all set for her trip to China. Evidence within the house indicated that she had arranged all the necessary items for her journey the following day. If she intended to end it all, why go through the trouble of getting ready for a trip she was never going to take? The notion of a collective decision within the group to end their lives together definitely has one thing going for it. What other reason could there be for taking their dog along? But then, why the sudden rush if this had been planned? And wouldn't they have worn something else? Another theory is that they accidentally drove into the reservoir due to some mishap, that it was an unfortunate accident during some kind of medical emergency or something similar. But this seems unlikely. Why would it be necessary for them all to go if it was a medical emergency involving one of them? And why bring the dog? And surely you can spare 30 seconds to put some proper clothes on. Were they abducted? Masahiro came from a prestigious family. but he forfeited his status as their heir when he ran away with Junko. The problem is, Masahiro was the one driving, so if anyone was doing the abducting, it was Masahiro himself. Police suspected that Masahiro was the actual culprit, and declared him responsible for the incident. As it turns out, he was the only one familiar with the route leading to the reservoir, since the road was mainly used by construction workers. Also, he was the one found in the driver's seat, so obviously he was in control of the car and where it went. Another possibly telling detail is that Masahiro was the only member of the family wearing normal clothes and not pajamas. But in his defense, perhaps he hadn't readied himself for bed yet when they suddenly decided to leave the house. But if he did coerce his family into the tragic act, how did he manage to convince them to put their sandals on and get into the car late at night dressed for bed? Adding fuel to the fire that Masahiro was to blame, rumours that Junko was having an affair with her boss had been circulating. Is it possible that Masahiro discovered the affair, and, due to jealousy and sorrow, he chose to bring everything to an end by deceiving his family into entering the car and driving it purposefully into the water? If the affair was genuine, their reputation might have been ruined, and this might have thrown them all into shame, so perhaps he decided to end everyone's life, including their beloved dog Leo. That being said, the alleged affair appeared to be solely grounded in rumours, and there seems to be insufficient evidence to uphold this theory. Junko and Masahiro appeared to have a wonderful relationship, and their daughter had a long life and bright prospects ahead of her. Another theory posed is that the family may have been trying to get away from somebody or something that was going after them. You could imagine a thriller or horror movie scenario where people do actually leave in such a state and such a hurry because the bad guys are after them, or a psychopath, malevolent spirit, or some other kind of evil is pursuing them. This could explain why they left so abruptly, and perhaps even why the front door was locked. And while trying to get away, possibly while being pursued, they tragically ended up in the reservoir. Some believe the family were cursed, a detail which wouldn't be out of place in one of the Japanese folk legends of old. Certainly, the Yamagami's case has many of the makings of such a folk story. Forbidden lovers defying their families in the name of true love. The beautiful child, and the happy and almost idyllic lifestyle, leading up to a sad and tragic ending. No doubt it was true life triumphs and tragedies that inspired many of the old legends, and perhaps in time, the story of the Yamagamis will become legend too. The idea that the family were trying to escape seems most likely to me, but Mr. V is convinced the whole thing was premeditated by the father. What's your take on the Yamagami mystery? Our next case is most certainly unique. The mystery in this story isn't exactly the case itself, but rather the incredible way in which it was solved. On the night of February 21st, 1977, a fire engulfing a Chicago apartment on North Pine Grove Avenue revealed a sad truth. The beloved resident, Teresita Bassa, who was a meek and quiet respiratory therapist, had met a very unpleasant end, leaving behind a grim scene, leading to a trail of unanswered questions. Firefighters fought the blaze, and soon detectives were on the scene. It was clear that this had been an act of arson, and much worse. Teresita's unclothed body was found underneath her burnt mattress, with a large knife embedded in her chest. Despite the detective's initial thoughts, the post-mortem investigation revealed she had not been the victim of SA. Investigators grappled with a chilling void. No clear motive, no smoking gun, just the charred remnants of a life extinguished. At the scene of the crime, there was one small shred of potential evidence that caught the investigating officer's eye. A simple memo that read, "Get theatre tickets for AS." Unfortunately, the investigation produced no actionable leads, even after interviewing Teresita's boyfriend, her family, friends and neighbours, leaving the detectives at an impasse. And despite their hunch that the person known as AS was involved in the crime, they were unable to find out who they were and what connection they had to Teresita. 5 months after her untimely demise, a glimmer of hope emerged from an unexpected and highly unusual source: Teresita's co-worker, Remy Chow. Driven by haunting visions and dreams where Teresita's spirit seemed to reach out, imploring her co-worker to go to the police, Remy, along with her husband Joe, felt compelled to seek justice. Getting in touch with Detective Stachula, they recalled their recent experiences in detail. It all started one night after Remy had finished a long shift at the hospital. She decided to take a brief nap in one of the lounges, and no sooner had she closed her eyes, a chill ran through her, and she felt what she described as a ghostly presence. Suddenly, an apparition of Teresita was standing before her, staring right at her. Remy was understandably terrified, not knowing what to do, and so she began to pray. This experience could obviously be written off as nothing more than a bad dream, but the story doesn't end here. A couple of weeks later, Remy was at home one evening with her husband, when she became very tired all of a sudden and decided to go and lay down. While Remy was asleep, she started sleep-talking to her husband in a way that really freaked him out. In Joe's terrified account, he said his wife's own voice morphed into someone else's and began pleading for help. When he asked who she was, she said, "Teresita Bassa." She claimed her killer was still at large, and with chilling clarity, she uttered the name, Alan Showery, a patient care assistant at the same hospital where Teresita had worked before she passed on. The voice implored him to go to the police and give them this information. Upon waking up, his wife had no memory of what had happened, and understandably, Joe was initially reluctant to follow up on the creepy message and contact the police. Wouldn't you have been? Unfortunately for Joe, Teresita's spirit was not going to give up easily. The second time she seemed to possess his wife, Remy, she questioned him. Why? Why did you not go to the police as I asked? Trying to reason with the voice, he explained that they had no evidence, and there was nothing they or the police could do. Teresita's voice told Joe that on the night of her death, her killer, Alan Showery, had stolen a ring and a jade pendant from her apartment and gifted them to his girlfriend. These were very specific and unique pieces of jewellery, which had been purchased decades ago in France by Teresita's father as a gift for her mother. After hearing the couple's incredible tale of the message from beyond the grave, to his credit, the detective still did his due diligence and followed up on the information he was given, no matter how crazy and far-fetched it seemed. After many years working as a detective, he could always tell when people were being sincere, and the couple truly believed the story they were telling him. One detail in the story certainly would have been the highlight for Detective Stachula. The name Alan Showery fit the initials AS, those found in the memo at Teresita's apartment. The detective subsequently ran a background check on the man's name, and not only did he exist, but he also lived near Teresita at the time of her death, and he worked at the same hospital she had. Further investigation led to the detective questioning some of Teresita's co-workers, who revealed that Alan Showery had made arrangements to visit Teresita that evening back in February to try and fix some kind of electrical fault with her television. Now the investigator had something more concrete to work with, information that put Showery in the vicinity of Teresita's home around the time that the heinous crime was committed. The next step in the investigation was to bring Showery in for questioning. Upon being interviewed, the suspect did not deny going to visit Teresita that evening and said he had indeed tried to fix the TV, but he didn't have the necessary tools for the job, and so he left. Detective Stachula wasn't buying this story, and so he later went and spoke to the suspect's girlfriend while Showery was still in custody. The detective asked if her boyfriend had given her any gifts or jewellery in the last few months, and she confirmed Showery had given her a ring and a pendant as a late Christmas present. Presumably with the understanding that he believed it was stolen property, the girlfriend agreed to accompany the detective and allow Teresita's family to view the items. The jewellery was subsequently identified as belonging to the deceased. Confronted with this breakthrough, Showery's facade collapsed, and he admitted his guilt, confessing he was indeed responsible for the death of Teresita Bassa that night. Showery explained that after he left her place, he decided that he was going to return and rob her. Going back to the apartment, she once again let him back in, and as soon as her back was turned, he attacked her, and then finished her off. He explained that the reason he removed her clothes was to make it look like the attack had other unpleasant motives. He then pulled the mattress off her bed, threw it over her, and set light to it, in a bid to destroy the evidence. The trial took place and was branded by many as the Voice from Beyond the Grave trial. The prosecution presented 13 witnesses over 4 days to a jury of 12 men and women. Although the initial tip-off had come from paranormal sources, there was no way that the prosecution could use this in a court of law, so this element was left out of the trial entirely. The fact is that all of the evidence independently gathered after the initial tip-off pointed to Showery's guilt, the prosecution declared. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until, on the 5th day of the trial, things took an unexpected turn. Despite the fact that Showery had previously admitted his guilt to the detective, the accused now claimed that he was not guilty and that he'd only confessed to the crime after police had fed him information and threatened to arrest him and his pregnant girlfriend on murder charges. The trial ended with a deadlocked jury since they couldn't agree on the verdict, and the court declared the case a mistrial. In a surprising turn of events, 1 month later, while waiting for the retrial, Alan Showery reversed his decision and chose to plead guilty. The outcome was a mere 14-year prison sentence. As one ponders the leniency of this punishment, you can't help but question whether justice has truly been served. The family must surely have felt it an insult to the memory of Teresita, a kind soul whose life was tragically cut short. Unbelievably, Showery only spent a little over 4 years incarcerated before being freed on parole, leaving us to reflect on the shortcomings of the legal system. Has true justice been achieved? We don't think so. Remy and Joe Chow had no more visitations from Teresita or any other paranormal experiences after the trial. Remy hated the media glare that surrounded their time in the spotlight, and they went on to live a quiet life after the media frenzy had died down. Many years later, together with their friend Carol Mercado, Remy and Joe wrote a book called A Voice from the Grave, which was published in 1994, recounting the whole story from their perspective. While some people want to believe Showery's sudden change of plea from not guilty to guilty was because he was haunted and tormented by Teresita, this is probably not the case. After reading and researching about this strange mystery, Showery's change of heart is much more likely to be explained as a logical decision. He was probably taking a more lenient plea bargain rather than risking a retrial with a whole new jury and an uncertain outcome. What isn't quite as easy to explain is the very detailed and specific information that the initial tip-off provided, the kind of information that only Teresita herself could have given. For many people, this case is clear evidence for the existence of ghosts, spirits, and the afterlife. What do you think? On September 10th, 1988, in the remote Taongi Atoll belonging to the Marshall Islands, marine biologist John Norton was leading a wildlife expedition, hoping to find an ideal site for a new sanctuary. As Norton and his team explored the narrow strip of land known as Sibilia Island, something caught their eye. They ventured closer to find the remains of a small battered boat resembling a Boston whaler beached on the island. As they closed in, Norton noticed some letters on the remaining registration, HA, indicating it was registered in the Hawaiian Islands over 2,000 miles away. But it was the following letters that were still visible, S, A, H, J, that suddenly grasped his attention in a vice-like grip. Could it be that this was the long-missing Sarah Jo, a boat that he had desperately tried to locate almost a decade prior during a massive search off Maui? Norton ordered his team to scout the area for any other signs of what happened, and more importantly, for signs of its missing crew. About 100 yards from the wreckage, the team made a chilling discovery. A crude grave made of coral rocks, topped with a cross that had been constructed out of driftwood. As they slowly peered in closer, they could see what looked like a human jawbone protruding from the rocks. Norton immediately notified the Coast Guard, who hastily dispatched a team to investigate further. Proving to be a macabre coincidence, the scattered wreckage was undeniably identified as the remains of the Sarah Jo. Dental records confirmed that the human remains belonged to Scott Moorman, one of the 5 men who had inexplicably vanished aboard that boat in 1979 after being caught in a fierce storm in Hawaii. To understand the significance of this gruesome discovery in 1988, we have to go back 9 years earlier and over 2,000 miles away, to Maui, where this story first begins. February 11th, 1979, Hana, Maui. The day had dawned bright and clear in the small Hawaiian town, with the water along Hana Bay appearing flat and as calm as a pond. For 5 experienced local men, it seemed perfect conditions to head out on a casual fishing trip aboard the 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Jo. The group of 5 friends with ages ranging from their mid-20s to late 30s, Benjamin Kalama, Ralph Maliakini, Scott Moorman, Patrick Wosner, and Peter Hanshett, gathered their equipment and stopped by to grab some supplies from Harry Hasegawa's general store before departing at around 10 a.m. With 50 years of combined sailing experience, and Ralph being a fisherman by trade, they were well versed in navigating the waters off Maui's eastern coast. During the initial hours, conditions stayed favourable and the weather fair. Time away from the hustle and bustle of regular life, out fishing, a few beers and a company of good friends. It's the stuff of dreams for many. The poor fellows probably had no inkling that a low-pressure system was brewing, a storm front that would soon unleash immensely strong winds and torrential rains. It was early in the afternoon when the dreamy day trip quickly descended into a nautical nightmare. What had begun as a picture-perfect morning had transformed into one of the worst storms to hit that area in over half a century. As the skies opened up and the storm began to rage, gale-force winds whipped up huge waves. The crew's family members back on land grew increasingly concerned. Benjamin Kalama's wife had been watching the horizon, hoping for their safe arrival. 3 boats returned to port that day, but none with the Sarah Joe. With fear in her heart, Benjamin's wife reported the missing boat to the authorities. The storm now fully raging and nightfall approaching, Peter's father, John Hanchett Sr., defied the risks and set out in his own boat to search for the missing men. But the treacherous conditions, described by the anxious father as the worst he'd ever seen, made his efforts futile that first night. The following day, he was right back out there again, this time joined by marine biologist John Norton and other volunteers. During the subsequent 5 days, the Coast Guard initiated an extensive air and sea search covering 73,000 square miles, marking it as one of the most significant operations in Hawaiian history. Unfortunately, their endeavours were hindered by formidable currents, limited visibility, and the profound uncertainty surrounding the Sarah Joe's whereabouts before being caught in the storm. Despite relentless exertions, no sign of the vessel or its 5 occupants surfaced throughout this period. Consequently, the search was officially halted, with no clues found and no further actions the Coast Guard could take. There was much protest by family, friends, and locals at the decision to give up the search. There was also a lot of criticism about how the Coast Guard conducted their operation, searching far too close to the island when the gale-force winds and strong currents would have quickly forced the Sarah Joe southwest. Also, the majority of the Coast Guard's efforts were focused on the 2 days with the worst visibility, while the last 3 days were clear, but operations were winding down. John Hanchett Sr. refused to give up hope so easily. He didn't want to accept that his son Peter may be gone forever. With the assistance of family members, friends, and donated funds and resources, he spearheaded a weeks-long private search effort. But despite thoroughly combing mile after mile of coastline and continued searches, the Sarah Joe and its crew appeared to have vanished without a trace. For 9 long years, the fate of the men aboard the Sarah Joe remained an agonizing mystery for those that they left behind in Hana. Memorials were held, but no remains were ever recovered, leaving families and the close-knit community clinging to faint hopes of impossible survival. There was no news, no leads, and no developments for nearly a decade, but that all changed with a discovery on the remote Marshall Islands in September 1988. Call it a bizarre coincidence or an incredible twist of fate, but it was none other than marine biologist John Norton, the same man who risked his own safety to help the desperate father search for his son and his friends back in Hawaii, who accidentally stumbled upon the remains of the Sarah Joe over 2,000 miles away in the Marshall Islands. The sheer improbability of this discovery, by the very same man who joined John Hanchett in the initial 1979 search operation, was staggering. But the mystery had taken an even stranger twist. As mentioned in the beginning of this story, about 100 yards from the wreckage, human remains were discovered and subsequently identified as belonging to one of the 5 friends, Scott Mormon. But something else was recovered from the grave. Investigators found an unusual stack of papers, unbound, with pieces of tinfoil appearing to be deliberately placed between each of the sheets. What on earth could this bizarre object be? The working theory posed by one investigator was that Mormon, after drifting at sea for up to 3 months aboard the damaged Sarah Joe, had somehow made landfall at the remote Taongai Atoll. There, they speculated he may have been discovered, deceased or still clinging to life, by illegal fishermen from China or Taiwan who buried him following ancient Chinese rituals. The theory continues that the slips of tinfoil and paper that were found were believed to be tokens following ancient Chinese traditions, meant to bring good fortune and wealth to the deceased in the afterlife. The fishermen did not report the American man's remains to the authorities, perhaps in fear of punishment for their own illegal activities being uncovered. One problem I personally have with his theory is the distances involved. It's well over 3,000 miles from China and Taiwan to Taongai Atoll, where the Sarah Joe and Scott's remains were found. It's a similar distance from the south of the United Kingdom to Long Island in New York. I'm no expert, but that seems one heck of a distance to travel for fishing. The other issue with the investigators' theory is one mentioned by Patrick Wozner's brother, Michael. In an interview with the Maui News newspaper in 2019, he pointed out the fact that burying the dead with a cross is not part of Chinese ancient traditions. And he's quite right. The use of the crucifix is very much a Christian tradition. Unfortunately, these points only help to muddy the truth further, rather than provide any clarity. Despite the incredible unlikelihood of Norton's 1988 find in the Marshalls, the lack of any other remains or any further clues still left the fates of the other 4 friends frustratingly unknown. Had they been claimed by the sea as the massive storm struck in 1979? Had they made it to land at some point, only to succumb later to injuries, exposure, or lack of fresh water? Had something else happened to them entirely? Many find the greatest source of bewilderment in this case concerns the boat's path and timeline after going missing. Based on drift analysis of the currents in the region, experts estimated it would have taken between 2 and 3 months for the Sarah Joe to have drifted all those miles southwest and wash ashore that spot in the Marshalls where the wreckage was found. However, records showed that in 1985, 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing, a geographical survey of that exact island chain had been conducted by American researchers, and neither the Sarah Joe nor any remains, graves or other evidence had been present at that time. This shows that the Sarah Joe didn't arrive at her final destination until a minimum of 6 years later, possibly more, sometime between the survey in 1985 and her discovery in 1989. This is a far cry from the 2 to 3 months of unpowered drifting estimated by the experts. Clearly something more had happened to the boat and her crew during that time, but the information is frustratingly lacking. In the decades following John Norton's astonishing find, the disappearance of the Sarah Joe and the fate of her crew, along with the peculiar circumstances in which the remains of Scott Mormon were found, make this case one of the most inscrutable maritime mysteries in modern history. What began with a pleasant outing among 5 friends turned into a tragedy, leaving a scattered trail of dead ends that only led to more unanswerable questions. Perhaps most maddening was the discovery of that sheaf of papers with tinfoil inserts, buried alongside Mormon. What was its purpose or significance? A hidden clue or message from the men? Part of a religious ritual? Maybe it was just a cruel red herring that would only lead to more speculation and dead ends. For the families of the vanished men, it remains a frustrating repetition of a lack of closure. While finally having confirmation that Mormon was deceased provided a measure of grim resolution, the hopes that the other 4 may have inexplicably survived, even against incredible odds, was perpetuated by the enduring questions. More than 45 years after the incident, Memorials honouring the men lost aboard the Sarah Joe continue to grace Hannah, a testament to the community's commitment to preserving their memory. Even as the enigma surrounding their disappearance persists, their names remain not just inscribed on their memorial plaque, but also etched into the collective consciousness of the local people, a poignant reminder that their final destinations, like the truth of their fate, may forever elude us, lost to the vast expanse of the sea.
This field behind at Hollingwell in Nottinghamshire is where it all went wrong yesterday. Whole families suddenly slumped to the ground.
On a beautiful summer morning in July 1980, the small town of Kirkby in Ashfield, England, was getting ready to host what seemed an innocent, even mundane event, a junior brass band competition to raise money for charity. Around 500 excited children from across the region had travelled to the picturesque Hollingwell showgrounds, looking forward to performing alongside their peers. Little did anyone know, this family-friendly festival was going to take a bizarre and terrifying turn straight out of a horror movie. The morning started off well, with fair weather and good spirits until about 10:30 AM, when things took a dramatic and unexpected turn for the worse. The first cries of panic began to ring out as both participants and spectators started collapsing to the ground without any apparent cause. Some were completely unconscious, others were simply vomiting and heaving. It started off with a few people, then more, and more. Within half an hour, the event on that serene summer morning had transformed into what one emergency worker described as looking like a battlefield, with people dropping here, there, and everywhere, bodies strewn across the grass. Adults were not immune, and many were affected by the unseen terror that seemed to be sweeping through the showground. As well as vomiting and fainting, other symptoms people suffered with included confusion, trembling, feeling of weakness, numbness, dizziness, nausea, and inflamed eyes and throats. Some even reported a metallic taste in their mouths. In a grim twist, as panicked parents and organisers rushed to loosen the kids' clothing to alleviate symptoms, they made an even more disturbing discovery. Inexplicable, fluid-filled blisters were forming on the exposed skin of some of the children. The incarnation of this real-life horror was unfolding rapidly right before their eyes. It's hard to imagine what a crazy scene it must have been, with crying children, worried parents and onlookers, no one really knowing what to do or how to make it stop. There didn't seem to be any pattern to who the next victim would be, and people from all parts of the event grounds were being affected, rather than being focused in a certain spot. As sheer panic and pandemonium took over the once joyful event grounds, the mysterious illness seemed to be spreading like wildfire, not just striking the young performers, but spectators, organisers, and even a couple of babies too. Oftentimes, families and groups had one or two stricken members, allowing the remaining unaffected members to attend to their friends and family. Unfortunately for Linda Elliott, this was not the case. Her daughter Kerry was first to fall victim, explaining that she suddenly became weak and started feeling unwell, with stomach pains and eventually fainted. The same thing happened to her 7-year-old brother Stephen. On the way to hospital, their mum Linda was comforting her 2 children when she too started feeling strange, accompanied by cramping pains in her stomach, and described that it felt like her arms and legs were sponges. Linda then passed out herself, only to wake up later in hospital. Terry Bingham, one of the band organisers, was driving 6 affected children to hospital when his eyes began stinging and watering. He also suffered chest pains as he drove, but thankfully he didn't lose consciousness like many others had. It was like nerve gas poisoning, he later explained when interviewed about the event. 37-year-old Margaret Palethorpe said she felt pins and needles in her tongue and lips, later collapsing and even losing the use of one of her arms for a while. There were dozens more stories just like this that came out in the media at the time. When all was said and done, a staggering 259 people had been affected that day, many of whom had been rushed away by ambulance. You can imagine this small town in the middle of nowhere, randomly and suddenly needing emergency services for this many people. It cannot be overstated that this was a major incident. Fortunately, besides 9 of the worst cases kept overnight, for most, the excruciating symptoms seemed to resolve reasonably quickly and without any physical complications, but long-lasting mental trauma would certainly persist for some. Long after the vomiting, tremors, fainting, and all the rest finally subsided, the harrowing question remained: what on earth had happened that day? With no obvious culprit or cause, everyone from shaken attendees to bewildered organisers began feverishly speculating and brainstorming possible explanations. The first, most likely guess put forward was food poisoning. At the event itself, as the madness had started to unfold, event organisers first suspected food poisoning or some other contamination was to blame. They made a series of announcements, first to avoid the food, then to stop drinking the water. Even the ice cream man was a potential scapegoat, and I gather some of the locals didn't let him forget that for a long time after. Subsequent food standards investigations found no problem with any of the food or vendors at the show that day. Water and soil samples were taken by environmental health investigators and tested for chemical and bacterial contaminants, but the results didn't show anything unusual in the samples. I suppose they had to chase up any lead or possible explanation, but as many have rightly pointed out, it doesn't make any sense that food poisoning could be to blame. After all, many attendees, especially the children taking part in the show, had brought their own packed lunches to eat. Furthermore, the sudden onset of symptoms, not to mention the range and severity of them, was not typical for an outbreak of food poisoning. Likewise, the second official guess at the cause of the problem, that being some kind of cold or flu virus outbreak, could equally be ruled out. Illnesses just don't spread and manifest symptoms that quickly. Then you've got the sudden recovery of the majority of victims. This is the final nail in the coffin for any idea that this could somehow be linked to food poisoning or illness. The next line of inquiry was some kind of airborne chemical or pollutant. Around the same time of the event in Hollingwell, there had been a massive fire in a plastics factory in Bulwell, around 6 miles away. The blaze raged for hours, throwing up thick black smoke as the whole place burned through the entire stock of flower pots and materials which were manufactured there. It seemed reasonable to some that the toxic smoke and chemicals could have been carried on the wind. Unfortunately for that theory, the wind had been blowing in the completely wrong direction. Furthermore, none of the police, firefighters, or locals who were exposed to the plastic smoke suffered from any of the symptoms described by the victims of the Hollingwell incident. Sticking to the airborne pollutant theme, it was also questioned whether some kind of weed killer or other agricultural chemical had been used on or near the showgrounds, which had caused the awful reactions that day. There are mixed reports about this, with some saying that none were used, while others say that they were used but not to blame for the incident. I believe both are true in a way, since at the time there were many inquiries at local farms, the Forestry Commission, and the checking of records and such, but nothing conclusive came from this avenue of investigation. Many years later, however, it was found that a weed killer containing a now banned chemical called tridomorph had possibly been used in that area, but not close enough to the time of the show where the incident took place. It's also widely accepted that even if the public had been exposed to the weed killer in question, it would not have caused the terrifying symptoms displayed by the victims. After all the investigations had concluded, the complete absence of credible leads or explanations forced officials to make a tough, controversial call after they could come up with no physical evidence and had exhausted all their inquiries. The official explanation for the sudden outbreak of sickness that struck down so many was all explained away as nothing more than a simple case of mass hysteria. Not any chemical or biological contamination, not illness or virus exposure or any other environmental factor, but a purely psychological phenomena born of high stress, heat, excitement, and strenuous conditions for the children. In other words, it was all in their heads, taken to the extreme, and that was all there was to it.
I feel a lot better than what I did yesterday, but my legs are still a bit shaky.
You don't think it might just have been something that went around because people saw that other people were being ill?
No, I don't think so.
You're quite sure you couldn't have been imagining it?
No, I weren't imagining it.
This brings us to probably the wildest and most chilling theory. The idea that the Hollingwell incident was potentially an intentional, clandestine test of a biological, chemical, or even radioactive weapon, conducted by an unknown entity. Believers of this theory reckon that hundreds of unsuspecting people gathered together out in one open area in the middle of nowhere would make a perfect target for a controlled trial. Those mysterious water blisters found on the kid's skin did seem a lot like mild radiation burns according to some assessments. And it's hard to fathom anything besides a specialized military-grade compound designed to rapidly incapacitate humans that could produce such wide-scale, severe, yet quickly fading symptoms witnessed that day. If true, a tightly coordinated cover-up by those responsible would have been critical to avoid igniting nationwide suspicion, so cancelling the event and dispersing the crowd as quickly as possible after confirming battlefield effectiveness would be key. Maybe that's why officials were so eager to accept and promote their vague hysteria theory without digging any deeper once blame could be deflected. Of course, the notion of any government or agency surreptitiously using its own citizens as medical test subjects for crowd control agents feels like the stuff of bizarre conspiracy fiction. An ethical line that even the most dogmatic warhawks would be apprehensive to cross, one would hope. And yet, as we've seen too many times throughout history, often the most unthinkable explanations that initially seem far too sinister or unbelievable turn out to eventually be proven true after the echoing truth finally sees daylight. From the MK Ultra mind control tests to the Guatemala syphilis trials, humanity has an unfortunate track record of powerful institutions harming innocents in the name of research and progress. So what really went down on that fateful summer day in Hollingwell? While the strange phenomena itself is thoroughly documented by witnesses and hospital records, its definitive root cause sadly remains an unsolved mystery over 4 decades later. Some chalk it up as a freak, albeit terrifying incident, a perfect storm of natural psychology and physiology combining in an inexplicable way, where groupthink, heat, dehydration, and surrounding conditions somehow reached a tipping point that manifested into mass hysteria and psychosomatic illnesses. But many others, both participants and skeptical onlookers alike, can't shake the nagging feeling that something much more intentional and sinister transpired on that field. That, for whatever motive, some powerful entity decided to run illegal tests on the cramped crowd that day, then quickly employed damage control to suppress and shroud the truth from the masses. In 2014, Dennis Skinner, a man who had served as a Member of Parliament for almost 50 years, explained his frustration with the verdict and the investigation at the time, saying, "They dismissed this incident as quickly as they could. I remain concerned about how it happened, and I don't believe it was properly investigated." Even to this day, there is still an appetite among many to reopen the inquiry and reinvestigate the event, but so far these calls have landed on deaf ears. This story reminded me very much of the case we covered last year, about the town in Kazakhstan where over 140 people were affected by a strange sleeping sickness. In both cases, victims seemed to be struck at random, while others beside them remained completely unaffected. But the case in Kazakhstan was spread over a much longer period of time, whereas the Hollingwell incident unfolded quickly, all within one day. Nothing like it had ever happened before in the history of Hollingwell, and nothing like it ever happened again, so it was indeed a unique, one-off phenomena. I personally don't think that whatever caused the Hollingwell incident was planned or purposeful. But at the same time, the official explanation of mass hysteria is clearly well off the mark. The investigation obviously wasn't done as thoroughly as it should have been, and was not conducted for long enough. I just can't help but feel like someone knows more about the truth behind this strange mystery. Our next case ranks pretty highly in the weird and creepy category, and is definitely one of the more unbelievable tales you may have heard from us here at Curious Dark so far. But the thing is, there are 9 independent witnesses, some of them in prominent positions, willing to give testimony to this weird and unexplained mystery. Although the story sounds like it could be the plot of a Stephen King novel, or indeed an episode of The Twilight Zone, like all of the unsolved and unexplained mysteries we cover, this case is most definitely not a work of fiction. The story starts with Donald Decker, a young man in his early 20s who was serving a short term at Monroe County Correctional Facility for the crime of receiving stolen goods. Allegedly, he had led a troubled youth, riddled with petty crime and drug use, but was generally considered a mild-mannered and polite young man. While serving his jail sentence, there had been a death in the family, and Don was granted a short leave of absence on compassionate grounds. And so, he travelled to his hometown of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, for the funeral on February 24th, 1983. The deceased was Don's grandfather, James, who had perished due to cirrhosis of the liver. Although Don was present to support his family during this sad time, unbeknownst to his family, Don carried with him a dark secret, a history of physical mistreatment at the hands of his late grandfather, a trauma that had haunted him since the tender age of 7. As he stood before the casket, watching the mourners pay their respects, Don felt a glimmer of hope that the evil that had shadowed his life would finally be laid to rest. But little did he know, the true horrors were just beginning to unfold. After attending his grandfather's funeral, where his parents spoke glowingly about a man who Don viewed more like a monster, he felt uneasy to say the least. To escape those feelings and to avoid any potential drama with his family, he decided to spend the night with his friends, Bob and Jeannie Kiefer. It was within the walls of this seemingly ordinary residence that the first signs of an otherworldly presence began to manifest. Back at the Kiefer residence, Don was in the upstairs bathroom when he was suddenly overwhelmed by an eerie, vacuum-like sensation, which he explained to feel like all the air had been sucked out of the room. He collapsed to the floor and then encountered a chilling vision of an old man mocking him in the bathroom window. The old man, who seemed to be wearing some sort of crown, continued laughing at him, and then, all of a sudden, real, physical scratches inexplicably appeared on Don's wrist. Back downstairs, the Kiefers noticed the scratches, and Don recounted the bizarre bathroom events, attributing the wounds to something upstairs. Later on, as they all relaxed in the living room, an icy chill suddenly permeated the air around the troubled young man. After a short moment of quiet, there was a loud, ominous noise from upstairs, and droplets of what they assumed was water began dropping down, almost as if it were raining indoors. Don now seemed to be entranced and unresponsive, oblivious to the strange phenomena unfolding before them. The Kiefers conferred amongst themselves. Nobody had left any water running, and neither of them had any idea what could be causing it. Fearing a leak or a burst pipe, they called their landlord, Ron Van Wy, and explained that there was an emergency at the house and that they needed his urgent assistance. The concerned landlord arrived soon after and began to investigate to try and find out the source of the water. Initially he, like Mr. and Mrs. Kiefer, suspected a plumbing issue, but then he recalled the complete absence of pipes in the front of the house, where the indoor rain seemed to be coming down. All of the water pipes for the kitchen and the bathroom were at the back of the house. Ron and Bob checked in the upstairs bathroom, which yielded nothing. No leaks or any hint of moisture were found. Ron concluded there simply wasn't a water source to explain the situation in logical terms. Back downstairs in the living room, they stood and observed the water further. Its behaviour defied explanation. It wasn't just falling from the ceiling, but unnaturally seeping sideways from the wall and even rising from the floor. The water seemed to come from all directions at once. Those present also noticed that the strange water left a slightly oily residue. The rest of the house remained curiously untouched, as if the rain had been conjured specifically to torment Don Decker, who remained in a trance-like state. Baffled and unnerved, Ron made the decision to involve the authorities and called the police. Officer John Bojan attended and was bewildered by the scene within the Kiefer house, and so he summoned his partner, Patrolman Richard Walbert. Walbert recounted that Bojan initially offered only a cryptic instruction to enter the house. Refusing a blind walk-in, Walbert demanded an explanation, but Bojan's response remained a simple, "Trust me, go in." With Bojan following closely, Walbert cautiously entered. A barrage of water droplets greeted him almost instantly. Standing by the doorway, he observed the baffling phenomena. Water droplets defying gravity, travelling horizontally. Adding to the strangeness, a large ball of water inexplicably passed between him and Bojan, drifting towards another room. An even more peculiar detail, the water seemed confined to the living room, leaving the rest of the house dry. Shaken by the unexplainable events, Officer Bojan recounted a chilling sensation as he traversed the house. He confessed that the situation defied his wildest imagination. There was simply no rational explanation for what they were witnessing. Officers Bojan and Walbert, at the loss of what to do next, decided to go back to the station and report the incident to Stroudsburg's Chief of Police, Gary Roberts. Meanwhile, the Kiefers and Don, famished after hours without eating, headed across the street to grab some food from a local restaurant. Ron, the landlord, was joined by his wife earlier that evening, and they both decided to stay behind at the house. Maybe they just weren't hungry, but I imagine the real reason that they stayed behind was so they could discuss the whole crazy matter privately, without their tenants around. This was, after all, their property that this was happening to. Curiously, the rain stopped almost as soon as the other three had left for the restaurant. Ron and his wife began to suspect that the strange phenomena was something to do with the Kiefers or even their unusual guest. Pam Scrofano, the owner of the restaurant across from the Kiefers' home, had witnessed the harrowing rain phenomenon herself earlier that day when she had visited the house. She became convinced it was all the devil's work, manifesting through Don. Pam urgently advised the Kiefers to call the church to have someone examine Don's situation and see what they could do to help. When Pam looked at Don, he again appeared to be in a trance-like state, staring blankly right through her, as if she didn't exist. This condition furthered her belief that he was possessed by some malevolent force. It was at this point that the strange rain returned, coming down right there in the restaurant as they all sat. Pam, determined to test her theory, retrieved a crucifix she had in her cash register. As soon as she placed the crucifix on Don's skin, it began burning him. Though he wanted to remove it, she instructed him to leave it on. Shockingly, the crucifix then turned black. This solidified Pam's conviction that Don was indeed possessed, and that this was a spiritual matter, again urging the Kiefers to have a priest evaluate Don's situation. As soon as Don and the Kiefers left the restaurant, so did the mysterious rain. Once they returned to the house, tension soon flared. Romain, suspecting Don was deliberately causing the chaos, verbally confronted him, along with Jeannie, demanding he stop the disruptions. As their accusations flew, a cacophony erupted in the kitchen. Pots, pans, and cabinets rattled violently. Then, plunging the room into darkness, the lights flickered and went out. Don's experience then defied comprehension. An unseen force lifted him from the floor, twisting his torso unnaturally. The brief levitation ended with a scream as he was hurled 5 feet across the kitchen and slammed into a corner. He described the sensation as being pushed from all directions simultaneously, leaving him feeling utterly helpless, and, as he described it, like a newborn, powerless to do anything. Dazed and terrified, Don found new scratches on his arm. Ron's wife Romain was now herself convinced of a malevolent presence, possibly demonic in nature. Jeannie, desperate to stop whatever was happening, grabbed a Bible and began reciting passages. When she did so, the strange rain seemed to exclusively target her. Some hours later, Officers Bojan and Walbert returned with Chief Roberts, a self-proclaimed skeptic. As Roberts entered the house, he too was showered with the rain, and was present during the water's strange behaviour, but he acted like nothing was wrong. Bojan suspected Roberts felt humiliated and pressured, perhaps expecting the police to provide an explanation or some help with the bizarre events. Chief Roberts, in stark contrast to the other officers, would later deny the entire incident. He dismissed it as a plumbing issue, not a police matter. He even went so far as to accuse Don and the Kiefers of playing a prank, He ordered the officers to vacate the premises and to refrain from filing a report, or even discussing the incident, a command that left the two officers frustrated and conflicted, knowing in their hearts that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Officer Walbert believed their chief simply wanted to wash his hands of the situation. Unable to explain or assist, Roberts offered nothing but dismissal of their experiences. The next day, defying the chief's direct orders, 3 veteran officers visited the Kiefers. Determined to find some answers, they placed a paper bag over Don's head to stop him from seeing what they were doing, and also to rule out the possibility that he was perhaps spitting. One of the officers, Bill Davies, recounted giving Don a gold cross to hold. Don immediately complained of a burning sensation and dropped it. Astonishingly, Davies confirmed that the cross was hot to touch, something he was unable to explain with logic. Moments later, the chaos resumed. Another officer, John Rundle, witnessed Don being lifted and thrown across the room with a force he likened to being struck by a bus. Upon removing the paper bag, they discovered fresh, bloody claw marks on Don's neck. Both Rundle and Davies openly admitted their utter bewilderment. Davies, a veteran of over 40 years, confessed this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He acknowledged that most events have explanations, but in Don Decker's case, he was left with none. By Sunday, February 27th, after repeated rejections from both Protestant and Catholic clergy, Ron finally convinced an evangelical preacher to visit the house and attempt an exorcism. With the Van Wys and the Kiefers keeping vigil, the Reverend began her prayers for Don. As the prayers commenced, Don exhibited a violent reaction, shaking and contorting his body. Ron and Romaine both noted a gradual change as the prayers continued. Don's physical convulsions subsided, replaced by a sense of calm. Romaine even described the entire house taking on a more peaceful atmosphere. Coinciding with the end of the Reverend's prayers, roughly an hour after her arrival, the inexplicable rain ceased. Relief washed over the grateful group. It seemed the ordeal was finally over. And for the Kiefers and the Van Wys, the ordeal was truly over. Unfortunately for Don Decker, there was still one chapter left in this supernatural story. Don's compassionate leave ended, and so he was transported back to jail to serve the remainder of his sentence at Monroe County Correctional Facility. It was there in his cell, far removed from his previous surroundings, that the strange rain returned within days. Don recounted simply thinking, "I wish it would rain in here," and moments later, water began seeping from the concrete floor, and his terrified cellmate demanded a transfer. This incident, according to Don, marked a turning point. No longer a passive victim of the inexplicable, he now claimed to wield control over the very phenomenon that had once tormented him. Don's demeanor transformed during this time, and it unnerved his fellow inmates. One guard, intrigued yet skeptical, confronted Don about the rain. With a newfound confidence bordering on arrogance, Don declared he could control it. This felt different. This time, he felt a surge of power, a sense that he could manipulate the rain at will. The unconvinced guard challenged him with a test. Make it rain in the warden's office. Meanwhile, Warden Dave Keenhold sat alone in his office, engrossed in paperwork. At 8 p.m, a guard arrived to discuss the strange situation with Don. As they spoke, the guard spotted a wet patch on Keenhold's chest, roughly 4 inches by 2 inches in size. Their attention shifted down the hall as they both noticed a small orb of water sailing towards them, It struck Keenhold squarely in the chest, then dispersed with a splash. This further evidence of Don's abilities left both the warden and the guard shaken and utterly bewildered. Faced with the strange rain in Don's cell, Keenhold summoned a plumber to try and make sense of the situation. However, the plumber's visit proved fruitless. He entered the cell, only to emerge flustered and refuse the job. Mumbling about not being called for this kind of stuff, he left without elaborating. Keenhold suspected the plumber had witnessed the bizarre rain too, and it had spooked him enough to leave. Alarmed by the strange events and Don Decker's general creepy vibe, Keenhold reached out to the chaplain assigned to their facility, Reverend William Blackburn, in a desperate plea for help. Thankfully, Reverend Blackburn agreed to visit the troubled young man. Upon meeting Don, the chaplain found him to be a rather meek and unassuming fellow. Don, who now seemed very keen to receive assistance, recounted the bizarre occurrences that had been plaguing him. Reverend Blackburn was unconvinced by Don's story, dismissing his claims and urging him to confess to making them all up. It was at this point that the encounter took a sharp turn. Don's entire demeanour shifted abruptly, and a pungent, unsettling odour filled the room. Apparently the same smell doctors and nurses report when encountering the dying, but amplified fivefold. It was an evil, foreboding smell, according to the Reverend. Don then told him that he had powers, and that he could make it rain. With a raised hand and a gesture of rubbing his fingers together, a misty rain materialized within the confines of the room. Reverend Blackburn now felt an undeniable presence of evil permeate the air. Ignoring Don's protest, the Reverend declared his intention to pray. Opening his Bible, Blackburn began to read aloud. Miraculously, the pages remained dry despite the misty rain. Fear gnawed at him, and he later admitted to praying more for his own protection than for Don's emancipation. After a brief period of fervent prayer, the rain suddenly stopped. Reverend Blackburn described a sense of calm settling over the room as he finished praying. Don, now overcome with emotion, thanked the Reverend and began to cry. In that moment, they embraced each other and prayed together. Reverend Blackburn was convinced of demonic possession. In his view, the events that transpired within the cell were beyond human capability. He held firm to his belief that Don's actions were undeniably spiritual in nature, but stemmed from a force far removed from God. Thankfully, that last encounter truly was the end of the matter. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, there were no more occurrences or even a hint of paranormal activity in Don's life or any of the other people who had encountered the Stroudsburg Rain Man. Reflecting back on the whole thing, Don was convinced it was his evil grandfather having one last chance to mistreat him, having been his victim all those years before. The story, like many unsolved and unexplained type cases, has its fair share of skeptics. One such fellow is a gentleman by the name of Robert Bartholomew, who put forward an explanation for the indoor rain phenomena. He believes a process known as ice damming was to blame. This is where the water from melting snow gets trapped on a roof by a wall of ice. This trapped water then makes its way under the roof tiles and into the building below. Although weather conditions at the time could have theoretically been suitable for ice damming to take place, many of you have probably already spotted where this theory falls flat. Where do we start? The fact that there were no other traces of water or moisture in the rest of the Kiefer's home. The fact that the rain happened in multiple locations, the Kiefer's living room, the restaurant, the prison. How about the fact that it started and stopped with Don coming and going? And the fact that it hadn't been spotted before or after and didn't take place anywhere else? Then there's the fact that the water behaved highly unusually, defying physics in various ways. Other skeptics of this case believe the entire thing was nothing more than a hoax. A big part of this argument is that there were no pictures taken to prove it happened. I would argue that the lack of photographs actually strengthens the case that this was a legitimate event and not fabricated. If a hoax had been planned and orchestrated, it would have been easy to get a camera and take some staged photos. Flinging water droplets horizontally off camera could be done to make it look like it was flying through the air. Scratches could have easily been faked or purposely inflicted. And I'm sure you could find inventive ways to make it look like water drops are cascading up a wall, or even sideways. People who stage hoaxes are prepared. People who are genuine victims of unexplained events are not. The truth is, when faced with scary or even life-threatening events, people's thoughts usually focus on self-preservation and dealing with the matter in hand, rather than thinking they should take a photograph. The thing for me, and countless others, that sets this case far apart from any notion of a hoax is the long list of independent witnesses to the events, including members of the clergy, police officers, prison guards, and even the warden himself. People who were largely unknown and disconnected from each other, and who had nothing to gain from it. Quite the opposite. Many of those involved put their reputations and name on the line by coming forward. While the bizarre events surrounding Donald Decker remain largely unexplained, the case stands as one of the most chilling and credible accounts of apparent paranormal phenomena. With so many eyewitnesses from all walks of life corroborating the details, it challenges our conventional understanding of what's possible. Whether the root cause was a dark spiritual force tormenting Decker, or something else entirely, the Stroudsburg Rain Man case is certainly one of the more compelling cases I've heard of. It leaves us to ponder the depths of the unknown that may lurk just beyond the limits of our perception. For those directly involved, the experience has lingered, an indelible testament to the mysteries that can manifest when the veil between the natural and supernatural worlds becomes perilously thin.